Dietrich Bonhoeffer's chilling warning about the age of stupidity. What if I told you that one of the greatest dangers to our civilization isn't war, poverty, disease, or even tyranny, but stupidity? Not the kind of stupidity we laugh about on the internet, or the type that's just a lack of education. No, I'm talking about something far more sinister and active, corrosive force that, if left unchecked, will rot the very foundations of our moral and intellectual integrity. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German theologian who resisted the Nazi regime and paid for it with his life, saw this danger more clearly than almost anyone else. He called it the age of stupidity not because people were simply uninformed, but because stupidity had taken on a moral dimension. I want you to sit with that for a second. What Bonhoeffer realized was that stupidity isn't just an intellectual failure. It's a spiritual and ethical failure, an abandonment of responsibility, and ultimately, a surrender of one's humanity. Let's break this down. Imagine you're in a society where people stop questioning, stop thinking critically, and start absorbing whatever ideology is most convenient. They conform. They outsource their morality to the crowd. They begin to mistake loudness for truth and popularity for wisdom. Sound familiar? Now ask yourself, are we living in such an age? Look around. How often do we find ourselves surrounded by people who are incredibly confident in their opinions, but frighteningly shallow in their reasoning? How often are we encouraged to think less, scroll more, speak louder, and reflect less? Bonhoeffer saw this happening in Nazi Germany, where ordinary people, not monsters, allowed horrors to unfold simply because they refused to think. And today, we're not facing the same regime, but the psychological mechanisms Bonhoeffer warned us about are eerily present.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more topics you love.
He wrote, "Stupidity is a more dangerous enemy of the good than malice." Think about that. We often believe that evil comes from evil people doing evil things. But what if the more pressing danger is not evil intentions, but the passive compliance of the thoughtless? What Bonhoeffer meant is chilling. A stupid person isn't just someone who lacks knowledge, they are someone who has stopped engaging with truth, who has stopped wrestling with complexity, and who has become a vessel for whatever ideas the system feeds them. And perhaps the most terrifying part, stupid people can be kind. They can be well-meaning. They might even be your friends, your family, your colleagues. But if they've surrendered their ability to think critically, if they've chosen comfort over truth, they can become tools for unspeakable harm. Now, I know that's a heavy claim, but let's be honest with ourselves for a moment. How often do we choose comfort over truth? How often do we turn away from something difficult, not because it's false, but because it challenges us? Maybe it would force us to change our behavior or confront our own hypocrisy. Maybe it would isolate us from the crowd. It's easier to go along with what everyone else says, isn't it? To laugh at the same jokes, share the same memes, repost the same slogans. But the moment we stop asking why, we become vulnerable not just to manipulation, but to becoming part of a machine that thinks for us. Bonhoeffer's warning was not just about governments or ideologies, it was about human nature. You and I are not immune. And here's where it gets even deeper. Stupidity, according to Bonhoeffer, is not an intellectual defect but a moral one. He believed that people become stupid when they become socially or psychologically dependent, when they surrender their autonomy to a group, a leader, an ideology. In other words, stupidity is a choice. It's a choice to stop thinking, a choice to trade responsibility for comfort, a choice to be a spectator in the theater of life instead of an active participant. And that means it's something we can resist, but only if we understand it. So ask yourself this: where in your life have you stopped thinking? What beliefs have you adopted without question? Are you living your truth or someone else's programming? These are not easy questions, but they are essential. Because if we don't ask them, we risk becoming part of the very problem Bonhoeffer died trying to expose. This isn't just about history, it's about now. It's about us. It's about what kind of world we are building or allowing to be built through our silence. And here's the paradox: the more noise there is in the world, the harder it becomes to hear the quiet voice of reason. We're inundated with information, yet starving for wisdom. We scroll endlessly, yet rarely pause to reflect. In such a world, stupidity thrives not because people are dumb, but because people are distracted. And distraction, in its ultimate form, is the death of thought. That's why Bonhoeffer's ideas are more relevant than ever. He's not just warning us about the past, he's screaming from the grave about the present. So I ask you, what would it look like to reclaim our minds from the age of stupidity? What would it mean to live with the courage to think, even when it's inconvenient? What would it require of us, not just intellectually, but morally, to become the kind of people who refuse to be used by systems of thoughtlessness? How stupidity becomes a moral failure that destroys societies. To understand the full weight of Bonhoeffer's warning, we must go deeper into the psychology of stupidity, not just as ignorance, but as a profound moral failure. Think about this: when someone chooses not to think, not to question, not to engage, they are not merely avoiding discomfort. They are relinquishing one of the most sacred duties of human existence, the duty to be conscious. That might sound dramatic, but it's true. Consciousness is not just awareness, it's responsibility. It's the inner voice that says, I will not go along with something just because it's popular. I will not accept something just because it's safe. When we abandon that voice, we don't just become passive, we become complicit. And that complicity, over time, is what kills societies from within. Bonhoeffer saw this happening in Nazi Germany, where millions of people, many of them ordinary citizens, turned a blind eye to atrocities. They didn't wake up one day and choose evil. They chose comfort. They chose social conformity. They chose not to think. And in doing so, they enabled the rise of one of the most destructive regimes in human history. This is what makes Bonhoeffer's insight so chilling. Evil doesn't need villains, it needs followers. It needs people who are too afraid to question, too lazy to investigate, too self-absorbed to care. And that is precisely what stupidity becomes when it is moral failure, the soil in which evil takes root. Now, let's pause and ask a difficult question. Could we be participating in the same kind of moral failure today? Not in the dramatic sense of enabling genocide, but in the subtle, everyday sense of ignoring injustice, tolerating lies, or refusing to challenge systems that dehumanize others. Think about the times you've stayed silent when you should have spoken up. The moments you've scrolled past suffering, the times you've echoed opinions you didn't truly understand, just to belong. Were those moments of neutrality? Or were they moments of complicity? Bonhoeffer believed that stupidity was more dangerous than malice because it is immune to reason. You can argue with a malicious person. You can hold them accountable. But the stupid person, especially the morally stupid person, is unreachable. They don't want to be reached. They've locked themselves in a fortress of slogans, memes, and social validation. They've outsourced their thinking to the crowd, and they wear that surrender like a badge of honor. What's worse, they often confuse their ignorance for righteousness, their conformity for virtue. And in that confusion, they become dangerous not just to themselves, but to everyone around them. So how does this moral stupidity spread? Well, it spreads through fear. Fear of being wrong. Fear of being alone. Fear of being rejected. And so people retreat into tribes, ideologies, echo chambers, anywhere they can feel safe from the burden of thinking. But here's the cruel irony: in trying to escape fear, they become its prisoners. Because true freedom, intellectual, moral, and spiritual freedom, requires the courage to stand alone, to risk being misunderstood, to say, "I don't know. Let me think about it." That is the beginning of wisdom. But how often do we reward that kind of courage in our society? When was the last time you saw someone praised for saying, "I don't have enough information to have an opinion"? Instead, we celebrate certainty. We reward outrage. We elevate those who speak the loudest, even when they know the least. That's not just a cultural problem, it's a moral crisis. Because when stupidity becomes a virtue, wisdom becomes a threat. And when wisdom is suppressed, civilization begins to fall apart, not suddenly, but gradually, like cracks forming in the foundation of a house. Look around. Do you see the cracks in our political discourse, in our educational systems, in our relationships? We are living in a time where the loudest voices often say the least, where disagreement is seen as hatred and complexity is treated as betrayal. That's the age of stupidity Bonhoeffer warned us about, not an age of low IQ, but an age of low responsibility. An age where people are more concerned with being liked than being right, where comfort is more important than truth, where slogans replace thought and performance replaces integrity. So let me ask you this: what are you doing to resist this age of stupidity? Are you thinking for yourself, or are you just reacting? Are you challenging your own beliefs, or just defending them? Are you seeking truth, or just validation? These questions aren't easy, but they are urgent. Because if we don't ask them, if we don't answer them honestly, we will become the very people Bonhoeffer tried to wake up. And by the time we realize what we've become, it may be too late. The quiet power of inner resistance in a thoughtless world, in a world that demands constant noise, constant reaction, and constant allegiance to the collective mood of the moment, then the most radical act you can perform is to think deeply, independently, and courageously. Bonhoeffer understood this long before the digital age accelerated our descent into distraction. He knew that resistance doesn't always begin with grand acts of rebellion. It often starts in the stillness of one's own mind. When we reclaim our ability to wonder, to question, to wrestle with uncertainty, we become dangerous not in the destructive sense, but in the liberating sense. We become immune to manipulation. We become immune to the propaganda of stupidity. In a society where conformity is the norm, independent thought is an act of revolution. But let's be honest, resistance is exhausting. It's not easy to swim against the current of groupthink. It's not easy to sit quietly with a difficult idea when everyone around you is shouting their opinions like battle cries. It's tempting to surrender, to pick a side, to adopt a script, to let someone else do the thinking for you. But here's the truth Bonhoeffer offers us: if you don't resist, you dissolve. You become a shadow of yourself, a hollow vessel filled with borrowed convictions. And eventually, you lose the capacity to even recognize your own voice. This isn't just a philosophical problem, it's a deeply human one. Because the moment we stop thinking for ourselves, we also stop feeling authentically. We confuse emotional reactions with moral clarity. We think outrage is the same thing as justice. We believe that being offended is the same thing as being right. But real moral clarity doesn't emerge from outrage, it emerges from reflection. It comes from sitting with pain, sitting with contradiction, and asking yourself, what is really true here? And often, the truth doesn't fit neatly into a tweet or a slogan. It's messy, it's uncomfortable. It forces you to ask, could I be wrong? That's what inner resistance requires, the humility to admit ignorance, and the strength to pursue truth anyway. Bonhoeffer lived this. He was born into a privileged family. He could have remained silent. He could have played it safe, kept his head down, and lived a long, comfortable life. But he chose to resist not with violence, but with conviction. He refused to let the stupidity of the regime around him define his conscience. And that quiet, unwavering resistance led him to the gallows. But even as he died, he was more alive than those who conformed, because he had not surrendered the most sacred part of himself, his integrity. So what does this look like for us today? Maybe it means turning off the algorithm for a while and sitting in silence. Maybe it means reading something that challenges your worldview. Maybe it means having a conversation where you listen more than you speak. Maybe it means refusing to go along with the latest outrage until you've done the hard work of understanding it fully. These might seem like small acts, but in a society that rewards reaction over reflection, they are revolutionary. And here's something else Bonhoeffer teaches us. Resistance must be rooted in love, not in pride, not in ego, but in a deep, abiding love for truth, for humanity, for justice. Stupidity thrives on fear and hatred. It grows in the soil of division. But wisdom, true wisdom, grows in the soil of compassion. When we think deeply not just to be right, but to do right, we begin to see others not as enemies, but as fellow travelers. Even those who have surrendered to stupidity are not beyond hope. But we cannot help them by mocking them. We help them by embodying a better way. A way that says, I will not let the crowd think for me. I will not let fear silence me. I will not let convenience define me. So I want to ask you this, what is the voice inside you that you've been ignoring? What truth have you sensed quietly in your most honest moments, but pushed away because it was inconvenient? What would happen if, just for one day, you listened to that voice instead of the noise around you? Would your life change? Would the world? Bonhoeffer's warning wasn't just about the collapse of societies, it was about the collapse of the self. When we fail to think, when we fail to resist, we lose more than our freedoms. We lose our souls. But the good news is, the path back is always open. The quiet power of inner resistance is still available to anyone brave enough to claim it. The final wake-up call, rebuilding a society that thinks. If Bonhoeffer's warning was a diagnosis of a civilization on the brink, then it is up to us to write the prescription. We've explored how stupidity, in his view, is not merely a lack of knowledge, but a moral and social sickness, a willing surrender of thought, a refusal to engage with truth, and a dangerous comfort in conformity. Now, the question remains, what do we do with this knowledge? How do we rebuild a society that thinks, that questions, that resists a slow death of critical consciousness? It starts with the individual. It starts with you. We often want systemic change, better governments, better media, better schools, and yes, those are important. But systems are built by people, and people are shaped by habits. If we want to change the trajectory of our society, we must begin by changing the habits of our minds. That means cultivating curiosity instead of certainty. It means treating our own beliefs with suspicion before we treat others with judgment. It means understanding that to truly honor truth, we must be willing to revise what we thought was true. That's not weakness, that's courage. Bonhoeffer believed that the battle for truth is first and foremost a battle within. He once wrote, "Action springs not from thought, but from a readiness for responsibility." In other words, thinking is not enough, it must lead to action. But not the kind of action that seeks applause. The kind that begins quietly, with integrity. That means speaking up when it's unpopular. It means refusing to laugh at ignorance when it's disguised as entertainment. It means asking questions, even when the answers might unsettle you. Because truth is not always comfortable, but it is always liberating. In a world of infinite content and shallow affirmation, the thinkers, the real thinkers, are rare. But they are powerful. They are the ones who slow down when everyone else speeds up. They are the ones who ask why when everyone else says of course. They are the ones who resist slogans, resist tribes, resist the easy answers. And because of that, they are often lonely. But Bonhoeffer reminds us, it is better to stand alone in truth than to drown in a sea of lies. And if enough people choose truth, the sea begins to part. A new path emerges not just for us, but for those who come after us. So what does a society that thinks actually look like? It's not a utopia. It's not a place without conflict or disagreement. In fact, it's a place full of disagreement, but disagreement that is honest, respectful, and rooted in shared pursuit of understanding. It's a society where people can say, "I don't know," without shame. Where people can change their minds without being mocked. Where schools teach students how to think, not what to think. Where media rewards depth, not outrage. Where leaders value wisdom over charisma. That's not just a dream. That's a possibility if we are willing to become the kinds of people who demand it. But here's the hardest truth. We may not see the full fruits of this labor in our lifetime. Bonhoeffer didn't. He died before the fall of the regime he stood against. But his legacy didn't die. His writings, his courage, his clarity, those things survived. And they continue to inspire because they were rooted in something deeper than politics or popularity. They were rooted in truth. That is the kind of legacy worth building. That is the kind of life worth living. So I leave you with this final question. Are you living in response to the world or in resistance to its worst instincts? Are you thinking your own thoughts or echoing someone else's? Are you building a life and a society that stands on the bedrock of truth or on the shifting sands of convenience? The age of stupidity is not inevitable. It is a choice. And every day, in 1,000 small ways, we cast our vote toward thought or away from it, toward truth or toward illusion, toward the light or back into the fog. Bonhoeffer's warning is not just a message from the past. It's a mirror held up to our present. Now the question is, what will you do with it?